This time on Classic Gaming Quarterly, we take a look back at the 1991 launch of one of the most iconic video game consoles of all time, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System.
You couldn't get enough of it. You ate Nintendo. You drank Nintendo. You slept Nintendo. Now, Toys R Us has the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. A new Nintendo system with Super Mario World, 3D graphics, 32,000 colors, 16-bit power. Toys R Us, the biggest video game store in the world.
It's virtually impossible to overstate the popularity of the Nintendo Entertainment System for a kid my age in the late 1980s. We woke up to Nintendo cartoons, ate Nintendo breakfast cereal, went to school with our Nintendo backpacks, checked the time on Nintendo wristwatches, talked about Nintendo on the school bus, daydreamed about it during class, ate out of Nintendo lunchboxes, traded game tips and bragged about new Nintendo games on the playground, and read Nintendo magazines and comic books. Beginning in 1983 and reaching its zenith 2 years later, the home video game market entered into a period of recession generally referred to as the video game crash. At the time, people wondered if home video games weren't just a fad that had reached the end of its life, and retailers began reclaiming shelf space for use selling other products. In 1985, having to swim against the tide to do so, Nintendo brought its 8-bit family computer, or Famicom, to North America as the Nintendo Entertainment System. Nintendo's business model allowed them to both avoid the pitfalls that caused the video game crash and establish themselves as the clear leader in the home video game market, leading to an unprecedented period of total market domination. The NES was not only the must-have video game system, but the must-have anything for kids in the late 1980s, and it isn't a stretch to say that the system caused a cultural revolution, at least among certain age groups. While the 16-bit generation technically started with the release of the Sega Genesis and TurboGrafx 16 in the summer of 1989, everyone knew that it didn't really start until Nintendo said it did. While the NES was still easily dominating the American market in 1990, the same could not be said in Japan, where 2 years earlier, the then 5-year-old Famicom was outsold by NEC's newly released PC Engine.
By Edison.
Nintendo may have been hesitant to unsettle the position of their console in North America with its 90% market share, but they could no longer afford to rest on their 8-bit laurels. Development of the Super Famicom began in 1988, with the first images being shown to the public later that year in Famicom Tsushin magazine. The system's hardware design was directed by Masayuki Uemura, the same engineer who had designed the original Famicom and who came out of retirement to head development of Nintendo's 16-bit console. The Super Famicom's hardware is centered around a custom-designed 3.58 MHz Ricoh CPU, which was based on Western Design Center's 65816 processor. This chip can trace its roots back to 1975's MOS Technologies 6502, which was chosen by Steve Wozniak for the Apple II, and which Ricoh themselves customized for Uemura many years earlier for use in the original Famicom. Speaking of the Apple II, the 65816 was the CPU used in the Apple II GS, which as a result was employed as a development station in the early days of the Super Famicom. The 65816 is not as fast as the Motorola 68000, around which the Sega Genesis is designed, but Uemura was designing the Super Famicom for visual and audio performance rather than processing power. The Super Famicom can handle 128 simultaneous sprites and up to 4 layers on screen at once. The system has a total palette of over 32,000 colors, of which up to 256 can be simultaneously used in a single layer, depending on the graphics mode used. There are a total of 8 such graphics modes numbered 0 through 7, though the last is the only one to enjoy popular name recognition. The Super Famicom produces 8 channels 16-bit sound thanks to 2 chips working in concert. The first is the Sony SPC700, famously and supposedly secretly designed by Sony engineer and father of the PlayStation Ken Kutaragi. The other chip, which sadly has a much less salacious history, is simply a 16-bit digital signal processor. The system did not have a headphone jack on it like the Genesis, but did output line-level stereo sound through the proprietary multi-AV jack. The Super Famicom controller felt instantly familiar to veterans of the 8-bit era. It retained the cross D-pad, doubled the number of action buttons on the face, and added 2 shoulder buttons. It was also given a much more ergonomic form factor than the rectangular controllers of the Famicom and NES. Although early speculation suggested that the system would be released in Japan in late 1989 and the United States the following summer, the Super Famicom wasn't released in Japan until late November of 1990. The system cost 25,000 yen, which was about $185 at the time, and as was usually the case with the systems in Japan, it did not come with a pack-in game, but gamers had 2 games to choose from on launch day, F-Zero and the sequel to Super Mario Bros. 3. The Super Famicom was pre-ordered by nearly 1.5 million gamers, and the initial shipment of 300,000 consoles sold out in just 2 hours. The Super Famicom was redesigned for its North American launch by Lance Barr, who worked full-time at Nintendo as an industrial designer, and who also redesigned the Famicom for the US market, as well as designing the shell for the NES Advantage joystick. Barr felt that the design of the Super Famicom looked too soft, or as he put it, like a bag of bread, and wanted a more angular design. The Super Nintendo made its major US press debut at the Summer Consumer Electronics Show in Chicago in early June of 1991. Attendees could play or watch game footage on giant projection screens of a number of early titles, including all 3 eventual launch games, plus Axelay, Super R-Type, and Super Ghouls and Ghosts. Almost exactly 2 years after the launch of both the Sega Genesis and TurboGrafx-16, the Super Nintendo began appearing in American stores in the 4th week of August, and into the hands of Nintendo fanatics who had been eagerly awaiting its arrival. The system retailed for $199.99, which was $50 more than the recently discounted Sega Genesis. However, the console came bundled with both RF and composite video cables, and Nintendo continued the tradition of including 2 controllers with the system. When this extra value is taken into account, the Super Nintendo actually only cost about 10% more than Sega's 16-bit offering. Still, this was twice the price of the NES, which led many parents to feel as though they were being ripped off by Nintendo, as they didn't understand why these new games couldn't be played on the hardware they'd already paid for. While by 1991 the writing was already on the wall concerning the fate of the TurboGrafx-16, the Sega Genesis was just starting to hit its stride. Up to this point, Sega had been fighting an 8-bit enemy with a 16-bit weapon, but from here on out the 2 companies' offerings would be much more evenly matched. And it was no coincidence that Sonic the Hedgehog was launched in North America just in time to beat the Super Nintendo to market. Sega had already been attacking Nintendo in its advertisements ever since Tom Kalinske took over as head of Sega of America, and they only ramped up the offensive with the release of the Super Nintendo. By the end of its first Christmas season, the Super Nintendo sold through 1.4 million systems, which, while an obvious success, was actually lower than projected sales. Still, it had taken Sega the entire year to sell 1.6 million systems, while Nintendo sold nearly as many in the span of just over 4 months. Although only 3 games were available on launch day, 2 more would follow by the end of August, and before the year was out, several games that would become absolute classics on the Super Nintendo were already on store shelves. All 3 launch games were developed by Nintendo's Entertainment Analysis and Development Group, led by the iconic Shigeru Miyamoto, who had just 15 months from the time they first saw the design of the machine until the launch titles had to be completed for the Japanese market. The first game, F-Zero, is a futuristic racing game responsible for the creation of the genre later made popular by games like Wipeout. According to the game's backstory, F-Zero takes place in the year 2560, when a new intergalactic motorsports league based on Formula One Grand Prix racing is created by a group of multi-billionaires. For as long as I've been playing this game, I never made the connection between F1 and F-Zero, and I'm a huge F1 fan. There are 4 cars which the game calls machines to choose from, each of course with their own characteristics. While the game only shows an acceleration curve for each, they also handle quite a bit differently due to differences in weight. You can also choose from 3 leagues dubbed Knight, Queen, and King, which feature racing circuits of increasing difficulty, although some tracks are really just variants of others. You also choose a difficulty setting for the game, which basically sets how hard the AI will be to race against. Unless you're a total beginner at this game, it's best to start with at least standard difficulty if you want any semblance of a challenge. It is of course impossible to talk about F-Zero without talking about Mode 7, which allows for scaling and rotation of a background layer on a scanline by scanline basis, creating a rotatable layer on the screen that appears to continue on into the horizon. The game provides you with the standard accelerator and brake, but thanks to the fact that your machine is hovering above the ground, you can also use the controller's shoulder buttons to shift your weight, allowing you to move laterally across the track or cut into corners in order to turn more sharply. With the completion of each lap, you're also given a Super Jet or S-Jet, which is a one-time use turbo boost. This not only allows you to go much faster, but it also lets you drive over rough patches in the track without slowing down. Some of the tracks feature jump plates or dash zones, and all the tracks are lined with an electrified guardrail. Anytime you bump into the rail, or other racers, your car loses some of its power, which acts as sort of a life meter. Lose all of your power, and your car will explode. Avoid this by driving through the pit row area on each lap to partially recover your machine's power, and be aware that some cars can take more damage than others. While you're only technically racing against the other ranked cars, once you complete the initial lap, backmarker cars who are much slower than you and whose only purpose seems to be to get in your way begin appearing on the track. To be honest, I found avoiding these guys to be the single biggest challenge in the game. While there's no debating that Super Mario World is one of the very best games released on the Super Nintendo, in its own way, F-Zero could be considered the killer app of the system's launch lineup. The game plays to the system's strengths as an audio-visual powerhouse, taking full advantage of both its expanded color palette and advanced sound chip. The game has a number of memorable musical tracks, although it's the song that plays during the very first race that I most closely associate with the game. Although each racetrack is of course unique in its design, their differing environments also give each a unique look and feel. I obviously think that F-Zero is awesome, but it isn't without its flaws. Chief among them being the game's rubber band AI. It's quite easy to catch the other cars in the race and take the lead, but once you do, it's impossible to build up any kind of real gap to the car behind you. The reverse is also true, however, as it's basically impossible to fall that far behind. As a racing game enthusiast, I find this frustrating as it de-incentivizes driving technique, but it doesn't really matter because the game is just a lot of fun. Any other criticism that I might level at F-Zero would be trivial at best, as I really do believe that this is a total must-play for the Super Nintendo. While I won't go so far as to call it a top 5 best game on the system, it's certainly in my top 5 favorites. F-Zero spawned a number of solid sequels, including the outstanding 1998 release F-Zero X for the Nintendo 64, 2001's F-Zero Maximum Velocity, which was actually a launch title on the Game Boy Advance, F-Zero GX released on the GameCube in 2003, and 2004's F-Zero GP Legend for the Game Boy Advance. Pilotwings has been accused of being little more than a tech demo of the Super Nintendo's Mode 7 scaling and rotation, and while I can understand where that line of thinking might come from, I don't think it's fair to dismiss the game as such. Pilotwings isn't a flight simulator, it's sort of a flight experience. The setup is that you are an entry-level member in a flight club, and you earn progressively higher licenses by completing lessons proctored by a colorful cast of instructors. Each lesson is made up of multiple events and has a requisite total number of points needed to obtain that license and move on to the next. The game has 4 different events, although not all 4 of them will necessarily appear in each lesson, and each one is exactly what it sounds like. In the parachute events, you hang onto a rope ladder while a helicopter lifts you high into the air. Once you let go and start to free fall, you have to tilt and turn your body to fall through a sequence of rings before deploying your parachute. Once you pull the ripcord, your job is to land on one of several targets of varying difficulty. Landing on the hardest target nets you the most points, or you can land on the moving target where you not only get maximum points, but get sent into a bonus round where you can earn even more. In the light plane events, you start off just accurately landing a plane before moving on to harder events involving flying through rings in the air, performing low altitude maneuvers, taking off and landing, and so on. While I find these events to be the easiest to complete, they're also the hardest for me to get maximum points on, and I wish the developers had taken advantage of the extra buttons on the Super Nintendo controller to give the player a bit more control over the plane. The rocket belt events are reminiscent to the guys that you sometimes see old footage of on TV who would fly these things at sporting events or air shows. While a real rocket belt only has enough fuel for a 21-second flight, in Pilotwings you have enough fuel to practically fly to the moon and back. Your objective in these stages is to take off, fly through several stationary rings, touch posts, or fly through moving rings, before making a successful landing on one of several targets. These levels once again give you the opportunity to land on a moving target, which earns you access to a bonus stage, and doing so with the rocket belt is much easier than with the parachute. The light plane tows you up to the sky to start the hang glider events, which have you riding thermal currents to reach some maximum altitude or fly through rings before landing. There's also the odd inclusion of helicopter combat levels. About halfway through the game, things take a dark turn when 3 of your instructors get kidnapped by a nameless evil syndicate and you're the only one who can save them. In these levels, you fly an attack helicopter into enemy territory and use missiles to take their anti-aircraft guns out before making a safe landing and rescuing your instructors choplifter style. At the end of the game, it happens again when the same people kidnap an unnamed government VIP. You basically play the same level over again, but at night and with more anti-aircraft guns. These levels seem very out of place compared to the rest of the game, but they're also awesome, so who cares? Much like F-Zero, the game makes heavy use of the Super Nintendo's new Mode 7 technology. It also provides a unique gameplay experience that absolutely makes the game worth checking out. The graphics in the game are colorful and detailed, and again like F-Zero is a game that really couldn't have been pulled off on the 8-bit NES. I also really like the soundtrack, which has an upbeat new age jazz feel to it. Pilotwings definitely has a much more relaxed pace and feel compared to not only the other two launch games, but to most video games. To some this will be a weakness, but to others it'll present a welcome alternative. My only real issue with Pilotwings is in how the scoring and difficulty are handled. In order to pass each lesson, you have to achieve a minimum aggregate score. If you fail to earn enough points in a single event, that aggregate score will no longer be possible. Unfortunately, Pilotwings doesn't give you lives or do-overs, so if you make a mistake in any single event, it can quite possibly be game over, especially in the later lessons. Still, all that really means is that Pilotwings requires a lot of patience, and is perhaps best played in short bursts if you're someone who's easily frustrated. It's certainly not a reason to avoid the game, which is often treated like the red-headed stepchild of the Super Nintendo's launch. It was of course sandwiched in between two legendary launch titles, and probably got buried under the amazing lineup of games that started coming out for the system immediately after launch, but in my opinion, Pilotwings would have been an excellent weekend rental if you were looking for something a little bit different. Super Mario World was the pack-in game for the Super Nintendo, the direct sequel to 1990's Super Mario Bros. 3, and is considered by many to be one of the greatest video games ever made. As the two games were released just months apart, Super Mario World is often compared to Sonic the Hedgehog. In fact, Sega ran an advertising campaign using a comparison between the two as a selling point for the Genesis, which they kicked off at the very same summer CES that also served as the Super Nintendo's coming out party. At first glance, Sonic is the more impressive looking game, but while Super Mario World may not look as visually striking as its competitor, under the hood you'll find what is quite possibly the greatest platform game ever created. In fact, while Sonic is clearly a pure platformer, Super Mario World is almost an adventure game in platformers' clothing. Super Mario World is similar in execution to Super Mario Bros. 3 in that it's split up into multiple worlds, each with a map that allows you to choose your path to a certain degree. While for some reason the levels in Super Mario Bros. 3 were short by usual standards, in this game they've been thankfully returned to normal size. This was by far the largest Super Mario Bros. Game released to date, with a total of 72 levels and 96 level exits, and finding all 96 is the benchmark for proper game completion. Levels that contain a secret exit are marked on the map with a red dot instead of yellow. Unlike Super Mario Bros. 3, you can also travel freely between worlds without the need of a warp whistle, allowing you to replay any level in the game. This is in fact essential to beating the game, as you will need to go back and replay levels after unlocking new blockhouses. This game is rife with secrets and unlockable worlds, and I'm hesitant to show too much here for fear of spoiling it for the uninitiated. Super Mario World is quite a bit more challenging than previous games in the series, which to me is a welcome improvement. Series mainstay enemies like Goombas, Koopa Troopas, and the hated Koopa Paratroopas are joined by a large cast of new foes, including Blargs, Super Koopas, and Charge and Chuck, as well as a colorful cast of Koopalings that act as end-of-world bosses. This installment in the series ditched the myriad of power-ups found in its predecessor, while retaining the Mushroom and Fire Flower and adding one new power-up, the Feather. This allows Mario to don a cape, which he can use to dispatch enemies with a spin move, and can also allow him to fly. This power-up is reminiscent of the Tanuki suit, the critical difference being that with the cape, Mario can remain airborne indefinitely. Super Mario World also serves as the debut of Yoshi, who has gone on to become one of Nintendo's most recognizable characters as the game takes place in his home of Dinosaur Island. You'll find Yoshi hidden inside certain blocks, and riding him gives you access to his expanded skill set. Riding Yoshi also allows Mario to absorb one extra hit, as it simply knocks him off and sends Yoshi into a panic. If you can catch him, you can jump back on, and if not, you'll just have to find him again. According to Miyamoto, he wanted to include a dinosaur companion for Mario as early as the original Super Mario Bros., but was prevented from doing so by the technical limitations of the hardware. The Yoshi character was designed by lead artist Shigefumi Hino in his first credited role at Nintendo. Hino would go on to direct Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island and still works at Nintendo to this day. Back when the Super Nintendo was released, many gamers actually complained that this game could have been done on the NES. I guess that's true in a superficial sense, but you could say that about a lot of games. Super Mario World may not make use of the Super Nintendo's new technology in as much of an in-your-face manner as the other two launch titles, but does a much more subtle job of incorporating the system's new features, including Mode 7 scaling and rotation, mosaic effects, the ability to place sprites behind background layers, background tile flipping, and a vastly increased color palette. In addition to the game's use of the console's new video technology, it also takes advantage of the expanded sound hardware. The music is head and shoulders above the NES releases and includes more exotic sounds like steel drums, while making appropriate use of echo effects in underground levels. Super Mario World's soundtrack was composed by Koji Kondo, who began working for Nintendo when he was just 22 years old, and who was responsible for almost every first-party Nintendo song that you've ever had stuck in your head. Kondo, who joined Nintendo straight out of college in 1984, is credited on over 120 games and currently serves as Nintendo's sound supervisor. While the game was of course produced by Shigeru Miyamoto, it was directed by Takashi Tezuka. Tezuka, who really should be more widely recognized than he actually is, began working for Nintendo in college as a summer intern before being hired full-time after graduation. He co-designed the first 3 Super Mario Bros. Games as well as the original Legend of Zelda, and still works at Nintendo as a senior producer. Considering the fact that Super Mario World was the high watermark in the series, it inexplicably never got a proper sequel. There was of course Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island, which was actually a prequel and was a great game in its own right, but it was certainly not a continuation of the Super Mario Bros. Lineage. While Nintendo did release Super Mario Land 2 6 Golden Coins on the Game Boy in 1992, the closest thing to an actual sequel has to be New Super Mario Bros., which was released on the Nintendo DS in 2006, 16 years after Super Mario World. It's impossible to use too many superlatives to describe this game, which is the very embodiment of Nintendo magic. Whenever someone asks what Super Nintendo game they should play next, be it Super Metroid, Earthbound, Chrono Trigger, etc., I always want to ask, have you beaten Super Mario World yet? It is the fundamental Super Nintendo game, and is a required experience for anyone who calls themselves a fan of the system. This is made all the more impressive by the fact that it was a launch title that found its way into the hands of over 20 million gamers. If you want to experience the Super Nintendo launch but don't have the system, All 3 launch games were recently released on the 3DS Virtual Console for about $8 each. That's going to do it for this episode of Classic Gaming Quarterly, but before we go, I'd like to thank a few people who helped make this episode happen. Chris Covell runs the website chrismcovell.com and graciously rescanned his issue of Famicom Tsushin magazine that served as the Japanese premiere of the Super Famicom. The CES footage you saw in this episode comes from YouTube user Digital Neo Human, who attended multiple CES shows in the 90s and brought along his Canon Hi8 camcorder. Lastly, a number of you have commented on the high-resolution box art and magazine scans used in many of my videos. These come from Matt Hensel, who runs VideoGameObsession.com. Guys like this help make me look good, so I truly do thank you. Thanks as always for watching, and I'll see you next time.